Stephen Glass certainly was not the first journalist to have plagiarized stories or made up stories from scratch. So let me tell you a little bit about some others. They include Janet Cook from the Washington Post, Mike Barnacle of the Boston Globe, and Jason Blair of the New York Times. Janet Cook, you can see a picture of her here. She was employed by the Washington Post shortly after graduating from college and working at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And so she started as a city beat reporter at a fairly young age in her mid to late 20s. And so she wrote an article that became very well known. It was called Jimmy's World. And it was printed in 1980. And it was a story, it was a feature story about a young boy living with his mother and his mother's boyfriend, and they were heroin addicts, and he was a heroin addict too. And she wrote the story of from the perspective of having visited the family and watching the young boy being shot up with heroin by the boyfriend. And she said she had promised anonymity or confidentiality to the family in order to get the story. Well, this story broke on a Sunday, Jimmy's World, and as you can imagine, people just, got very excited and agitated by it. Social services people wanted to find little Jimmy, police wanted to find little Jimmy, and she said no, she had promised her subjects confidentiality, and that's kind of sacred turf for journalists. And so, people backed off and left her alone. And then what happened was she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and that's kind of the Academy Award for journalism. And so some of her own fellow reporters at the Washington Post were doing a background story on her as part of a piece on her being nominated for a Pulitzer. And in their background research, they found some discrepancies in her biography. For example, she said she had graduated from Vassar, and then they found she had not. She said that she had worked on the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and she had not. And so they found that she had fabricated parts of her resume. So, of course, the thinking is if she fabricates her resume, could she have been fabricating the story as well? When her editors confronted her, she broke down and admitted that she had made up Jimmy. However, he was a composite of many people she had met, but he was a made-up character. So she very quietly left the Washington Post. She was exposed and kind of went into oblivion. She had to get back the Pulitzer, of course. And the legacy of this incident was that most newsrooms required that in cases where reporters promised sources confidentiality, they at least had to identify the sources to the editors. And this gives you an idea. This is what the story read like, and you can read here. It's a very compelling lead. So as you read through this, you can imagine just how concerned people were who read about this story. And as you read through this too, you can see she's a very gifted writer. So anyway, she was exposed and kind of went into oblivion after that. Mike Barnacle was a very seasoned reporter. He was a commentator for the Boston Globe. And so in 1998, he published an op-ed kind of piece when he was accused from plagiarizing from George Carlin's kind of monologue or monograph piece called Brain Droppings. If you remember, George Carlin was a stand-up comedian, popular during the 70s and 80s, famous for a piece called The 7 Dirty Words You Can't Say on Television. And so Barnacle's column was called I Was Just Thinking, And this gives you an idea of the kinds of things he borrowed from George Carlin without giving him appropriate attribution. And when somebody pointed out this sounded very similar to George Carlin, he had denied that he had read him and, that it was all coincidental. And here was Barnacle's response. And I always like to play a little bit of George Carlin just so you get a little taste of him.
You know, there are some things you never see. A puppet with a heart on. A butterfly with a swastika design. The Latin word for douchebag. Someone defecating in a church. A junkie with leisure time. A serial killer with a light-up bow tie. A mom-and-pop steel mill. A shot glass full of carrot juice. A bum with matching luggage. Really interesting twins. Condoms with pictures of the saints. Two homosexuals who own a bait shop. A pimp with a low profit margin. Or a Rolls Royce that's more than 50%
So anyway, you just get a little... He has some kind of, offbeat, a little bit bawdy, sort of whimsical observations on the world. Now, Jason Blair is probably as well known as Stephen Glass. He was a graduate of University of Maryland, where he was the editor of the Diamondback, which is the student newspaper. And he had interned with the New York Times and then was later hired in an effort that the Times, as well as other newspapers, were trying to diversify their newsrooms. And apparently he had a substance abuse problem, and so oftentimes would write his stories in a bar. And so he was finally caught when he plagiarized a story from a former co-intern from the New York Times, who was now working for the San Antonio Express News. And it was about visiting the home of a fallen soldier from the Iraq War. And so the piece in the San Antonio Express talked about, visiting the home and talking about the surroundings. And so his piece was eerily similar.